This week, we'll hear from 2 more senior officers about their roles in the RCMP response to the mass casualty. As the Support Services Officer for H Division in April 2020, Superintendent Darren Campbell joins us today to talk about his role, including how information is managed during a critical incident and public communications made following the mass casualty. We've also reserved the day tomorrow so we can continue to hear from Superintendent Campbell as needed, ensuring there is plenty of time for questions from Commission Counsel and Participant Counsel. On Wednesday, Chief Superintendent Chris Leather will be here as a witness to talk about his role as Criminal Operations Officer for the RCMP in Nova Scotia at the time of the mass casualty. We have reserved more time to hear from Chief Superintendent Leather on Thursday if needed. Later in August, we will also hear from retired Assistant Commissioner Lee Bergerman and Commissioner Brenda Lucki. Hearing from these senior RCMP officers at this stage means questions for them will be informed by everything we have learned to date about what happened, how, and why. As you know, all of that information is captured in the many foundational documents, supporting materials, commissioned reports, recorded proceedings, and other resources on our website. By hearing from these senior officers, we also hope to learn from them about lessons learned, changes made to date, and opportunities for additional changes and improvements. I will now ask Senior Commission Counsel Rachel Young to begin. Ms. Young.
I understand that Chief Superintendent Campbell wishes to be sworn.
Just place your right hand on the Bible, please. Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Be seated, please.
You were interviewed twice by the Mass Casualty Commission on June 28th and July 12th, 2022, each for full days.
Yes.
We discussed a number of topics already in those interviews, and those transcripts will be made available on the Commission's website, and they've been made available to the media. So we've discussed your background, your role at H Division, your involvement in the events of April 18th and 19th, 2020, and their aftermath, H Division Critical Incident Preparedness, RCMP Public Communications, your role in communicating with victims' families and those most affected, the treatment of crime scene evidence, and emergency operational plans. And so I don't intend to go over a lot of that same ground today. What I want to ask you about today is to explain your role within the RCMP, to give us some context, and in the mass casualty events and their aftermath. And then I'm going to ask you some questions that we didn't get to in your interview about the family liaison officer, how information is managed in a critical incident, using some examples from the events to discuss that, and to go through some statements you made in the media, post-event learning, and any recommendations you may have for improvement in the RCMP based on what you saw during the events.
I spent my formative years in the province of New Brunswick. I graduated from high school in New Brunswick, attended the University of New Brunswick, and then I joined the RCMP in 1990. Following joining the RCMP, all members of the RCMP are trained at the RCMP Training Academy in Regina for a 6-month period of time. And of course, subsequent to that basic training, there's a degree of courses and training that are offered to officers depending upon the roles that they occupy within the RCMP and their progression through the organization. So several courses within the RCMP and also outside of the RCMP as well. I'm also a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. I also instruct and teach at the Canadian Police College, as well as instruct or lecture at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia as well. I do have ICS training. I believe I have ICS training levels 100, 200, and 300. And the reason why I have that training is that I'm also an accredited major case management team commander. And as part of my accreditation process for an awareness level of ICS, I was required to take the levels 1, 2, and 3.
In turn, it's your responsibility to then update the CROPS officer as you learn new information?
Yeah, so my normal practice would be as soon as I would receive a call and I would activate the critical incident program, I would send a message to the criminal operations officer, Chris Leather, notifying him that we've activated the critical incident program somewhere in the province. I do believe that a mobile active shooter who has been active, dormant, reactivated is not a common event. And since April of 2020, I've been scouring the internet looking for similar events and circumstances to try to see how those events played out, and there is not much out there in terms of active, dormant, active, mobile, and then of course you add in the fact that an offender is operating a fully marked replica police vehicle. I could find one incident in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where an individual had stolen a police car that of course they could track, but this was a unique, very unique circumstance.
And how many ERT team members are there supposed to be total?
Well, in a perfect world, there was a modernization. There were 2 iterations of a modernization review that were completed. I think the last one in either 2018 or 19. And the recommendation is that each provincial ERT team should have 18 resources, full-time.
Have there ever been 18 full-time H Division ERT team members?
Full-time, no. No. So at the time of April 2020, you had 6 full-time, 3 funded by the federal government, 3 funded by the province. The RCMP internally were pressure funding 6 positions, and then we had additional part-timers. So we were sitting in and around 12 to 14 ERT members, because I did believe in that modernization study. The expectations of the police in terms of critical incident response are high, and they should be. And these teams need to be prepared and ready. And the only way we can be prepared and ready is if we have the necessary number of resources to ensure that we have adequate coverage and that they are given the opportunity to be able to train, deploy, and then rest. I mentioned about the geography that we're required to cover.
Yes.
And the first element to trying to make a change in terms of critical incident response, specifically ERT is what I'm talking about right now, was building up capacity and ensuring that we had unfettered access to the necessary numbers of ERT members. Further to that is to be able to get them faster to all points within the province. Which would be everywhere from the northern tip of Cape Breton Island to the southern tip of the province. We need to be able to get those resources and their equipment to those locations much quicker. And it's not just the ERT team, it's the critical incident commanders, it's the police service dogs, it's the emergency, the EMRT, the emergency medical response technicians who are part of the ERT team. It's all of those resources. The aspects in and around the police car were really quite important to me, and how that was communicated and how that was understood. And as part of that debriefing, I was trying to understand what it is we knew and when we knew it, and how we, and I'm talking about those that were responding at the time, interpreted that information. And through the course of that conversation, what was imparted to me is that they had this information, they looked at multiple possibilities of what they thought it could possibly be, everything from a decommissioned vehicle that might have had remnants of markings on it, to one of our vehicles that had been stolen, or an officer had been, their vehicle had been commandeered. All those things were taking place, and they were eliminating the fact that it wasn't one of our vehicles, that no one had been reported injured or their vehicle stolen. Those things, I was told, were happening in the background, and they were eliminating those possibilities. What I think happened, which is, I think, an element of human nature and perhaps biases that are created through our own experiences is that the realistic possibility of someone creating a replica police car was probably lost on individuals.
And possibly hard to believe or hard to accept.
Well, the likelihood of someone who had created that to a degree in which the perpetrator did, I would say, and again, I don't want to speak for others, but my sense is that that was a factor that contributed to that miscommunication. If they had known that we were looking for, if they had made that assessment and communicated everyone, we are looking for a marked police car. Whether it's real or not, we don't know. Certainly that would have made a difference.
That would have been more accurate, we now know, right? Or based on the first call, if that had gotten across.
It would, because it would have, for example, without understanding that, any responding officer could have seen a police vehicle in the area and just thought they were another responding police vehicle. And we could have missed an opportunity for engaging the individual.
And so this insertion of assumptions or interpretations, or let's call it a bias towards what is most probable, is that part of the usual protocol for receiving and analyzing witness information?
I just think it's a byproduct of human nature. I mean, we all have our biases, and we all have biases based on our past experiences. And, you know, in 32 years of policing, I myself have never encountered someone who had created a replica police car. So the reason why I say that is that, you know, I myself could have been in that situation, and my biases may have taken over and led me to believe that that was not a realistic possibility.
What is your approach? What is your understanding of your obligation to inform the public about ongoing investigations?
Well, it would be two things. I mean, there's one element of the victims and the families, what they need to know, and then there's the public in terms of what the public wants to know. And then there's the element of being able to protect any ongoing investigation. You don't want to taint witnesses. You don't want to disadvantage the investigation by releasing information that might cause someone to destroy evidence, etc., things like that. So you're trying to find that balance between saying as much as you can say without negatively impacting your ongoing investigation. So every RCMP division would have a strategic communications unit, and their job or their specialty would be to support and assist any person, doesn't matter what level of rank they are in the organization. If they're going to be speaking publicly on an incident, they would help guide the individual that would be providing a public address.
But they're not telling you what your responsibilities are they?
Well, I think that they're fully aware what the responsibilities are. When you ask me about the policy, I mean, for me to be able to read every single policy in every area, that's not really my area. I mean, certainly I would have interest in it, but I don't necessarily have the time to be reading policy all day long. I'm involved in operations, so they would help guide an individual because they would have full awareness. They would have input in what those policies look like. So they would help guide the individual in terms of you know, trying to provide as much information as possible. And of course, on the policing side, the operational side, it's trying to, as I said before, protect the integrity of the investigation by not disclosing information that might have an adverse or negative effect on the ongoing investigation.
When you say guiding the individual, you mean the communications professionals guiding the RCMP officer who is doing the speaking as a spokesperson?
Yes, though, in terms of guidance, maybe it might be helpful for me to break down exactly what that guidance might look like. It would include discussions and conversations in and around what can we say. And then they might actually prepare the script based on consultation with the investigative team and the individual that might be doing the press briefing about what it is that can be said. And they may prepare those speaking notes, which would then be reviewed by the individual who's actually going to deliver those speaking notes, and then if there's any modifications that need to be made. In this particular case, the National Headquarters Strategic Communications Unit was involved in discussions between Strategic Communications and Nova Scotia as well. So they were sharing that information. So they had awareness in and around what it is that was going to be said. And then it was finalized and then given to the individual that was going to provide that press briefing. And then, of course, that information would be delivered. They would also do some preparations with the individual that would be speaking to the public based on anticipated questions. Things that might not necessarily be covered within the speaking notes, but things that naturally might be asked. And they often will help walk the individual that's doing the press briefing through, okay, if you may experience this question or you may receive this question, how would you answer that?
Chief Superintendent Leather was the H Division spokesperson at the earliest press conferences, and then you took over on April 24th, 2020. Why was that changed?
I think that was changed mainly because of the fact that many of my programs were involved in once the critical incident program was established and going forward. So I was obviously very involved in trying to understand exactly what had happened and what was happening in terms of the investigation. And it just seemed to be more of a natural or more efficient way to be able to take over the press briefings from that point in time.
So you said you didn't have those numbers available and the RCMP doesn't normally disclose them, but that over 25 units responded to the area. My question is, did you have concerns about the staffing levels on April 18th and 19th, 2020 in Northeast Nova?
I have concerns over staffing levels all the time, every single day. I didn't know the exact numbers, because district policing in Northeast Nova wasn't under my area of responsibility, or I had no actual awareness of that in terms of the general duty resources that were out there. But to say it as simply as I possibly can, every single day, I always have concerns over the level of resources on our front lines because I believe wholeheartedly that we are considerably understaffed in order to be able to meet the expectations that the public has of us and our ability to make sure that our responding officers out there are properly supported.
At the bottom of page 11, you set out some comparisons of number of officers per 100,000 residents, which looks like you got from Statistics Canada 2018. And
2019, I believe.
It just says Statistics Canada Police Resources in Canada 2018 there in the middle of the page,
Okay.
which I'm assuming is the source you're citing. Does that sound right?
Yeah, for some reason I seem to think that the last time that Stats Canada actually, they always do this, I think, every 3 years.
And the numbers there do say 2019.
Yeah, so I think that might have been a typing error by me putting in there 2018. I believe the 2019, and I'm quite familiar, I do look at these quite often because I do believe that this is a very important aspect that needs to be examined and addressed and fully understood by the Commission.
Right, and you cited information that with Halifax Regional Police Service, the 2019 average was 209 officers per 100,000 residents. The Truro Police 2019 average was 286 officers per 100,000 residents. And the Colchester County RCMP 2019 average was 76 officers per 100,000 residents. So regardless of the size of the community, the ratio is the ratio. Can you explain why the number is so much lower for the RCMP there?
Well, I can't specifically explain the reasons why the numbers are so lower. I mean, certainly our resource levels are based on the contracts and what communities are willing to pay and support in terms of their police resourcing models. But it's not just about officers per population. What is critically important for people to understand, particularly in a rural environment, is it's even more so about the number of officers per square kilometer that they have to cover.
Because that'll affect response times?
It it will have a negative impact or a potential negative impact on our response times to calls to be able to deliver emergency services, as well as the safety of our officers in terms of their backup. So when you're already running, in that document that I put together, there are, Stats Canada will look at, and I need to make sure that this is fully understood and that it's clear. Stats Canada will look at police forces that have populations of 250 or greater. So those will be available publicly on Stats Canada website. The Canadian national average of police officers per 100,000 people is 180 officers per 100,000. That's across all police forces in Canada. So we can call that 1.8 per thousand people. Maybe that makes it a little bit easier for Nova Scotia because we have a population, I think, that just hit the scales of 1 million people. The Nova Scotia average is 192. These are 2019 numbers, and these are Stats Canada numbers. It's 192 officers per 100,000 people, or 1.92. So someone would say to themselves, well, that's not bad. That's better than the national average. But the reality is that you have to look at breaking that down. The municipal policing average, when you break the numbers down based on the population that you serve versus the number of members that you have on strength, is that the average should work out to 253 officers per 100,000 people on the municipal side, or 123 officers for RCMP members per 100,000 people. But we are largely policing rural areas, which means that we are policing rural areas with half the resources that our municipal counterparts do, who have a much more confined geographic area of responsibility. Therefore, it affects response times, therefore it affects public safety, therefore it affects officer safety as well.
That a full review was done after every critical incident and that a review would take place. But my understanding from what you're saying today is that that has not happened. Is that right?
A formalized independent review has not happened. And as I testified to earlier, that is exactly what I wanted.
And do you understand why not? Why it hasn't happened?
Well, I explained in my testimony earlier that as I understood the response that I received is that people above me felt that the Mass Casualty Commission was going to be looking at the response, but I saw it differently.
Whose decision was it to say no?
I don't know whose decision ultimately it was to say no, and I don't think that globally speaking, there was a lot of support. Like for the conversations that I had very specifically with Superintendent Phil Liu, Chief Superintendent 𝐎𝐲𝐸, they agreed, and they were working on trying to make that happen for me. But ultimately, whose decision it was at the end, I'm not aware of whose decision that was.
So that wasn't communicated to you?
Not directly, no. Like this. Once the investigation is fully complete, there should be really no reason why, aside from disclosing information that would normally be protected under privacy for individuals, why the entire investigation would be open to ATIP or other means for people to be able to gain access to that.
Is the investigation not complete now?
Well, the investigation in terms of Gabriel Wortman's involvement, I would say is complete, and being able to determine what evidence exists that support his involvement in all of the murders. In terms of those that assisted him, I would say for me personally, I'm not satisfied that we've been able to conclude what I believe the expectations of survivors and victim families would expect, and personally me as a police officer and an investigator, what I would wish to accomplish in terms of the provision of the firearms. That is the outstanding element for me.
So how he obtained the firearms you're referring to?
How he obtained the firearms and how he brought those firearms into the country.
But to the extent that those suspects might be the United States, the RCMP has no control over, as far as you're aware, those American investigations are closed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And there were some people charged in Canada. Those court processes are almost finished, so there's no active investigation here. right?
Well, in terms of any investigation, if it's not concluded to the satisfaction of those involved, or those that have a vested interest in it, it's always open. It's always available for being reopened based on new information or a new direction.
So that's the status of the 𝐻-Strong investigation now, right?
The 𝐻-Strong investigation is still in a point where if any new information is received, the file coordinator is still maintaining the investigation data set. And then if there's anything that is still needed, or that the communications between the 𝐻-Strong 2 team and the investigative team, those are ongoing, and the file coordinator would facilitate any requests for information, or if there's anything new, it will get funneled into the file coordinator for additional tasking if required.
So by the 𝐻-Strong 2 team, you mean the officers who are liaising with this commission?
Yes, that's correct.
But there's no active investigation. It's
There's nothing.
sitting there
There's
for
nothing
more
active that I know of that's going on right now.
And
If you're
so-
talking about investigators that are out there chasing down tips, conducting interviews, I'm not aware of any right now. No.
And so then what would be the prompt to actually officially close the investigation, knowing that, as you say, it could be reopened at any time if there's new evidence?
Well, I think
Will it
just
be
given the
closed?
magnitude of this investigation, it's not a normal or a standard investigation. We still have a command triangle in place. Those roles are firmly established. This file will remain in a state where if anything new is received, it will be placed on the investigative file, and if it requires additional follow-up, it will be tasked out.
So back to the April 28th press conference, you provided some details about the weapons of the perpetrator, but also declined to answer some questions. Can we look at page 62, please, Madam Registrar? You did confirm that there was a weapon that you referred to as a military-style assault weapon. You confirmed that there were several semi-automatic handguns, I think at page 60, and 2 semi-automatic rifles. There were some details that you did not provide, and so can you say why you did not provide full details?
Absolutely, because there was still, at that time, we were 9 days post the April 18th and 19th events. We were still involved in multi-agency investigations as part of those objectives that I mentioned. One, determining what role Gabriel Wortman played in the murders, as well as any individual that may have assisted him in any way. So we had Canada Border Services Agency that was looking into the possibility of the smuggling of the firearms across the Canadian border. We had the ATF and the FBI that we were working with respect to conducting an investigation into how the perpetrator had obtained firearms on the U.S. side of the border. So those were ongoing aspects. Why? I would not give any particular details. I guess the best way I can answer that is I'll give you a simple analogy.
Well,
I talked about...
Can I just ask you, not an analogy, but what I need to understand is how would the release of information like the type and caliber of the firearms jeopardize the ongoing investigation?
Our ability to assess the credibility and the weight of any individual that would come forward with a witness statement was going to be dependent upon the accuracy of the information they provide us. So what does that do? One, we can determine whether or not they have firsthand or, because we had possession of those weapons, we knew about the make, model, caliber, serial numbers, any additions that were placed on those weapons. All of those details were very important to us keeping outside of a larger audience, because we have a much difficult time assessing the weight of witness statements, but not just that. If we went to a covert application, for example, an undercover operation, and we receive a confession from an individual, if they're able to tell us the specific details that we've never made public, the weight of that confession is significantly better. So the weight of of the witness statements that are provided help us narrow our focus on the value of certain witnesses, as well as the weight of any confessions that an offender may make.
And whose decision was it not to disclose that information?
I'd spoken earlier about the structure applied to major case investigations, and the first principle, there are 9 of them under major case management. The first one is command triangle. That command triangle is comprised of a team commander, a primary investigator, and a file coordinator. The 3 of them make the decision as to what information needs to be held back that could potentially jeopardize an investigation.
So
those discussions,
you talked to them before the press conference?
I speak with those individuals all the time. And I'm fully aware, because I'm an accredited major case team commander, I understand the importance of holding back certain types of information and how that could negatively affect an investigation. So I'd had previous conversations about the fact that we couldn't release that information. For me, simply the way I can put it is it was a no-brainer. It was a no-brainer. And through those conversations, I supported them in that position. And if you were to ask where the buck stopped in terms of that, eventually it should be with the team commander, but I was aligned with the team commander's perspective, so it was ending with me because I was doing the press conference.
And can we go to page 7, please? Those are the attendees at the top, and then in the right-hand column we see the speakers. And it should be lower down where Superintendent Campbell is speaking. And looking for a passage that says, just want to mention one quick thing here about the intent not to release at this time. Oh yeah, it's at the first bullet point there. So it says, you mentioned the fact about the ongoing investigation. It would be helpful just to tell everyone that, and as you mentioned, when you were first doing your investigation, we're obviously running down the source of the American guns, and that we're working with our counterparts on the state side. The timing of that information contained in the bulletin that he had access to weapons and or that he had firearms. You know, the reason why we want to hold back as much detail as possible about it is that's because of the ongoing investigation. You recall that meeting?
You know, I don't really have a specific recollection of the meeting. I don't, because there were so many meetings that we were having on so many issues. I do remember discussions in and around much of the background interactions with the police, whether it be through the Officer Safety Bulletin. There was a threats file as well that was investigated by the HRP. Those were things that we were trying to get a better understanding of. But as those, there must be minutes that were taken from the meeting. Again, the focus was, you know, the guns that the individual had in their possession, were they any of these guns that were mentioned within the Officer Safety Bulletin? We didn't know that. We're trying to investigate that. Again, as I said before, like depending upon what information you release, it could have a benefit, but it also could have a detrimental effect on your ongoing investigation. Again, we were days into this. We had a very large task ahead of us, and we wanted to make sure that we were going to be able to do the investigation as best as we possibly could. When I say here that the information wasn't very helpful, it's confusing at the very least in terms of retention periods on many different types of files. There's different types of investigations that have a longer retention period, and there are others that have lower retention periods. I was making these inquiries because I expected questions in and around, when did you know this? Why didn't you know this if you didn't know it? And I was trying to understand that, and I found that the information I eventually received back from Ottawa wasn't helping me understand that, but as I was understanding it, is that they were, and I'd had conversations with others in the CIS&S world, I can't remember specifically who it was, about the retention periods on some of these bulletins, and I was told it was a 2-year retention period. I would like to think that the retention period on an officer safety bulletin that suggested that someone illegally possessed firearms and they had an intent to kill someone, it wouldn't matter who it was, that would be important to retain for an extended period of time, in my view. You
say in this statement that while there are outstanding issues about what happened in April, to, quote, ensure a fair trial for those who've been charged, and with the public inquiry now ongoing, end quote, then quote again, the RCMP will respectfully refrain from further commenting on these matters outside of the inquiry, close quote. Whose decision was it to have no further communications outside the inquiry?
So in fairness to any individual that's been charged, we wouldn't make any further comment if they were before the courts, specifically on that one matter. And at that time, I can't recall exactly when we were notified that there would be the Mass Casualty Commission. I was also, and others, wanted to remain respectful of not saying anything over and above what we had already said in an effort to not influence anyone. We wanted to make sure that the Mass Casualty Commission was able to carry out its work and be able to communicate its findings to the public.
Was that your decision, or were you ordered not to have any further media contact?
Well, no, I wouldn't say it was. I mean, I had a perspective on that. I felt that in terms of any information that we could add that wasn't going to be prejudicial to an individual who had been charged, then we should be able to do that. Any information relative to any of the subsequent charges, that would be unfair to be able to comment further on that. But specifically in terms of when you asked the question, was I ordered not to say anything further, there were conversations between our strategic communications personnel here in Nova Scotia and those at our national headquarters in Ottawa, specifically in and around further commentary or documentary programs that were asking for further information. I felt that as long as it dealt with things that were staying away from any charges before the courts, and as long as it was related to material that we had already spoken to, that we might be able to answer further questions on because we'd already released that information, I was comfortable in doing that. But there was a decision internally from Ottawa that we would refrain from participating further.
So the commissioner didn't want you to participate further, but you would have to the extent possible without jeopardizing the ongoing prosecution?
Well, I can't say it was the commissioner. All I know was direction from national headquarters, strategic communications. Who would have provided that direction? I don't know.
Who were you hearing it from in national communications?
Well, it's our national communications employees were discussing that directly with, I believe it was Lisa Banfield, who was our Strategic Communications Director in Nova Scotia.
And who was speaking to Ms. Scanlon, do you know?
I don't know specifically who it was. I would imagine it would have been some of the key individuals within Strategic Communications nationally. Sharon Tessier, possibly. I think she was the Director General. But
You referred to the fact that you were willing to cooperate with documentaries, for example. So before the charges were laid in the fall of 2020, you recall there was some internal discussions about whether the RCMP should participate in an episode of The Fifth Estate that was being prepared about the mass casualty and its aftermath?
Yes, I remember that.
And we're going to look, or I'm going to exhibit some emails on the topic. I understand that you and others were initially in favor of participating, albeit on certain conditions, but that this was vetoed at the last minute by the commissioner?
Yes, I seem to recall that, as a division, we had made a decision that we would participate and that I was comfortable in doing that. But it might be a fair characterization in the last minute that was reversed by Ottawa.
September 23rd, 2020, Leah Scanlon distributed a communications brief about the proposed interview, which you had approved, and Lee Bergerman had approved, and it appeared to be pending approval by Chris Leather, which is indicated on red in the document. And so that the brief states, among other things, that the announcement of an inquiry does not preclude the RCMP from speaking to the media. Instead, it underlines the importance of knowing who should speak. And so why were you in favor of participating in that Fifth Estate program?
Well, I was in favor largely because of the fact that it was clear to me that there was much interest in what had happened. I mean, it was a catastrophic series of events that many people had questions about. And my concern always is that if we don't say anything, there's this perception that we're hiding something. And I didn't want that perception to become a reality. And I think it's important to be able to speak to what you can speak to as fully as you possibly can, considering all aspects of what had happened, as well as continuing with an ongoing investigation, because of the fact that at that point in time, as I mentioned earlier, there was still the ongoing investigation that we were hoping to make some advancements on in terms of the U.S. side. So trying to balance that. But I think that it's fair and it's appropriate, and in my view, still to this day, it's necessary to be able to say as much as you possibly can, because there will be so many questions.
Can you tell us what you would have been willing to talk about that you didn't talk about because you weren't allowed to in the end?
Well, I can't specifically remember the details of the communications brief without actually physically reading it right now and trying to get my mind back to that period of time.
This is an email dated September 28th, 2020, where you forwarded an email from the CBC to Ms. Scanlon. The email indicated that the meeting with the Fifth Estate had been cancelled and was asking Commissioner Lucki, copying you, to reconsider. Whose decision was it to cancel the meeting with the Fifth Estate?
Again, as I have already testified, I don't know specifically whose decision it was. Obviously, if there's an email that references the commissioner, I would imagine the commissioner might have weighed in, as well as the deputy commissioner of Contract and Indigenous Policing, because the commanding officer of the division would report up through Deputy Commissioner Brian Brennan, who's obviously a member of the Senior Executive Committee in Ottawa. So between those individuals, I would imagine someone within that core group had made that final decision, but I don't know who it was.
So this is an email from Jennifer Clark to you, dated September 28th, 2020. Who's Jennifer Clark?
Jennifer Clark is one of the public information officers. She is now retired. She was a regular member of the RCMP. You might remember Jennifer Clark as being the individual that I co-conducted the April 24th press conference with.
Okay. And can we just scroll down and see if there's a chain there? Okay. So we can scroll back up again. So just read that. So this is Corporal Clark's email to you. She was pretty much crushed. That's referring to the reporter. Elizabeth wants to be able to tell the whole story, and she can't do that if we don't play ball. I absolutely understand her frustration with trying to give us an opportunity to speak when we really need to, for the benefit of Heidi and the other victims, for our members, and for their families. Over the weekend, I had dinner with a friend of mine who retired 5 years ago. I was shocked at how he was affected by all this. Just goes to show how badly people need answers. But the commissioner has other ideas, apparently. Thanks, Darren, Jen. So does that refresh your memory as to whose idea it was to cancel that?
Well, I mean, that's Jen Clark's referencing the commissioner. Sometimes people will assume that the commissioner is making decisions when it could be someone directly reporting to the commissioner.
So starting at the bottom, there's an email to Jennifer Clark from Elizabeth, who's the CBC, Elizabeth McMillan, who's the CBC reporter. And then if you can scroll back up, and that's copying you. And then this is an email from Gillian Finley, the CBC, to Commissioner Lucki, dated September 28th, 2020. And that's copying you. And then above that, we have September 29th, 2020, email from Brenda Lucki, RCMP Commissioner, to Ms. Finley. Oh, can we just stay there? And she says, in order to protect the integrity of the public inquiry, unfortunately, we will not be participating in this interview. So that's Commissioner Lucki directly communicating with the media. And then if you can just scroll up, that's the reporter's response, or Gillian Finley's response to the commissioner. And then if you can go up again, please. This gets forwarded, and Lee Bergerman says to you, Leah Scanlon, and Chris Leather, regarding the reporter's response, saw that coming as soon as I read the commissioner's response. So does that now refresh your memory that it was Commissioner Lucki saying no?
It certainly does, and thank you for showing that to me. As I said before, I would have received multiple emails. So until I've had an opportunity to see that, it's quite clear to me that it was Commissioner Lucki's decision not to.
And was it the commissioner's individual decision, or do you know who else was involved in that strategy to stop talking to the media?
Well, I don't know, but I would expect that through the course of normal conversations and reporting up, the Deputy Commissioner of Contract and Indigenous Policing would have had some level of awareness of these discussions between the division and the Commissioner. And again, I appreciate the fact that you've shown me these emails because it does help me. There's been much that has happened.
Is H Division allowed to have an independent communication strategy?
I think that there's a lot within the organization, being a national organization, where if you're dealing with an event like this that has national interest, national implications, that you would have a lot more involvement from Ottawa. Normally, day-to-day operations would be allowed to carry on, and there wouldn't be an inject from national communications on a singular event or a homicide file. But given the nature and the scope of what happened here, there was a lot more oversight or a lot more interest in injects by Ottawa.
And this, I'm starting now into the transcript of the April 28th press conference. And again, you were the speaker for the RCMP with the translation assistance of Corporal Clark. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And in this press conference, and just for your reference, I'm looking at the 5th paragraph down. You say, at this time, priority areas for us are to determine how the gunman obtained access to the equipment that he used and to establish the gunman's movements before and after April 18th and 19th. We also want to determine if anyone had knowledge of the gunman's plan, if any, and if they assisted him in any way. And a couple of questions following up from that. We do know that ultimately charges were laid against 3 individuals for providing ammunition.
That's correct, yes.
And we know that the RCMP conducted an investigation or assisted in an investigation by the FBI in the United States.
That's correct, yes.
And ultimately no charges were laid against Mr. Conlog or others in the United States, correct?
By U.S. authorities, no.
Were others investigated as well that I haven't mentioned? That is the 3 that charges were actually laid against, and the Americans, were other people investigated?
Yes.
Could you tell me who those were?
Well, there would have been an investigation in terms of the procurement of certain things like the decals. So Peter Griffin was subject to further investigation.
And I take it that that investigation has concluded.
I believe that there is nothing in that investigation that would have warranted any additional charges.
Anybody else besides Mr. Griffin?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
The first sentence of the last paragraph says, what can be confirmed is that the gunman had acquired all of these firearms illegally. And before we even get to the stage of where the guns came from, I'm going to suggest to you that because the gunman didn't have a PAL, possession of any gun by him was illegal, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Except under special circumstances such as being at a gun club or having possession of somebody else's gun while they were hunting and that person was with him. Other than that, him possessing guns was illegal just for that fact.
The transfer or the possession would have been legal, yes.
Okay. From your knowledge of investigating matters and your role as a senior RCMP officer, if somebody is alleged to be suffering from a mental disturbance and that they have guns, would it be standard procedure to immediately check and see if that person has a PAL to even be allowed to possess a gun?
It wouldn't be just for that scenario. For example, if police were called to any type of file, they would conduct a query to determine whether the person had lawful possession of any firearms.
And I know we're getting into a bit of a hypothetical here, but I'm sure somebody will object if I go too far. So I'm referring specifically to the BOLO, the Officer Safety Bulletin that went out in 2011. And the allegation in that bulletin was that Gabriel Wortman was suffering from a mental crisis and had possession of guns. And I'm asking, when an investigating officer received that information, would or should one of the first steps have been to see if he had a PAL to allow him to legally possess guns?
I believe so, and I think at that point in time they would have called that an FAC, or a firearms acquisition certificate, and that would be a standard or a normal course of inquiry that an investigator would make, yes. And
if the allegation was that the subject had possession of guns and no PAL or FAC was found, would it then be procedure to get a search warrant to go to that person's place to see if they in fact had guns?
Well, it would be very case dependent on the information provided, and as you would know, as an experienced counsel, it would require specific information in terms of locations, the time in which they were seen, and of course, you just don't get a search warrant. You have to make an application based on grounds, and if there's sufficient grounds for justice to issue a warrant, then that warrant would then be authorized.
And I won't get you to speculate on what information would be required to get the search warrant, but to your knowledge, no attempt to get a search warrant was made in relation to the Officer Safety Bulletin in 2011.
I have very limited knowledge as to what transpired in 2011 specific to that complaint. I know that there were two different police forces involved in that. The level of available file material from at least the RCMP is limited, so it's hard for me to make any further comment on it.
You've been in the news with respect to your notes and the April 2020 telephone conference with the Commissioner Lucki and Ms. Scanlon and others in attendance. And you've read Ms. Scanlon's letter to the Commissioner, sent it about a year later, I guess, have you?
I've seen it, yes.
Yes. And the Commissioner, as you might know, testified before a parliamentary committee yesterday. Did you hear her evidence or summary of her evidence?
I'm aware that she did.
Okay. So as I understand it, and not speaking for the Commissioner, in the lead up from when your notes became in the public forum somewhat famous or infamous, depending, the Commissioner, of course, says there's no political interference, and so did the Minister, and the Commissioner apologized for, I guess, maybe the tone of the meeting. Do you today accept there was no political interference in the Mass Casualty Commission, in the Mass Casualty investigation by the RCMP? Do you accept that?
What I will say is that my notes are an accurate description of my recollection of that conversation and some of the words that were used. What transpired between the Commissioner's office and anyone within government, I'm not privy to that. I was never part of that. I stand by my notes, and when I was asked a question earlier today in terms of whether or not I would be concerned about soiling the reputation of the force, my answer is that I think I've demonstrated that.
So I'm just not clear. So now we're 2 years post-incident. Do you feel it was political interference or not in regards to the investigation?
Well, I'll be subject to a parliamentary committee appearance in Ottawa in the coming days, which I will give evidence to that. But I'll speak to that as best as I can at this stage. I was very concerned because for me, as a former team commander who understands the need to protect certain information so that you could advance your investigation and hopefully meet your objectives. And I'd already outlined what those objectives were. And the fact that we had an ongoing investigation that was both local or domestic and international, that there was a very good reason why we could not release those details. And we owed it to particularly the victims, survivors, and their families to do our very best to be able to meet those objectives, period. And any interference, whether it be political or otherwise, that would have deterred us from properly investigating these offenses and seeking the justice that the families deserved was unacceptable for me. So whatever that would have been, whether it was political or not, I was very concerned that if it was political, if it was politically motivated, how the families would perceive that. That bothered me.
And so in addition to just retaining it, it needs to be accessible to members as well. And I wanted to get your input on how, if we could leave aside the privacy concerns that would lead to purging, how do you believe this information could be not just retained, but preserved in a manner that could be readily accessible by members so that they are on guard for the information that has been contained in such a bulletin. So in this bulletin, for example, it ended with, use extreme caution when dealing with this perpetrator. What is, in your experience, what would be the best way that that could be accessed by members as they're going out to respond to a call at a home?
So traditionally, there's the Canadian Police Information Centre. You've heard the acronym CPIC. A lot of the time, if someone is in a certain category, there's special interest to police, they could be added onto CPIC. That is probably the one consistent database that any police officer across the country, because it doesn't matter whether that individual is in Nova Scotia, they could be on vacation in Manitoba. If there's an interaction, if there was a CPIC query, any officer, any law enforcement or peace officer would have access through CPIC to be able to make that query and receive that information. So depending upon, again, and you have to either maintain or purge those based on whether the person's been charged. So I don't know whether it's feasible for there to be an indefinite entry into CPIC on something like that, or how fair that might be to an individual if, for example, they've changed their life. That's one avenue. The second avenue, obviously, would be records management systems available to police. And it makes it more difficult when there are multiple records management systems that officers do not have the ability to access fully. If, for example, it's one records management system that has that information and the incident's happening somewhere else. So I'm a firm believer in one RMS or one records management system accessible to all police officers, because being able to access that information can make a significant difference. And in this province, there are at least 2 records management systems within the policing environment here as a package.
So let's just stick with the words used in the press release here, and I think we agree that the words used, that the on-call management who immediately initiated the call out of a full critical incident package really isn't reflective of that timeline and chronology that we went through, is it?
Well, it depends upon how you interpret the words, but if you're speaking specifically about actually placing a phone call, no, it's not. But if they're contemplating it to start that process, one could consider it that way.
Reading further, the critical incident package consisted of, and then it lists the resources, and then it picks up in additional, just a typo, so in addition to the first responders who are already on scene and continuing to arrive. The critical incident package added more than 30 additional highly specialized resources to the response.
Yes.
Right, so we see that. We know that it took well over 2 hours for the ERT team to arrive, correct?
I don't know the exact time. I'd have to look at the documents to be able to say it was over 2 hours, but I know that it takes time to move all of those resources, to have them all in place together at once. And I know for a fact it was well over an hour, because it takes well over an hour to make that drive from Halifax.
Well, if you rely on the after-action report, ERT was noted as arriving at, start to arrive on scene. Mills says 12:50. EMRT is 12:55. The TAV is noted as 1 a.m. in this document. That's what I'll put to you. So that's several hours, almost 3 hours after the initial 911 call, right?
From the initial 911 call, yes.
Yes, yeah. You'd agree that this press release can give the impression that the resources were deployed immediately, that they were on site forthwith, and it can contribute to sort of a misunderstanding in the public about police response times in this mass casualty event.
Well, there could be, that could be an outcome, but in terms of a greater context, the immediacy of the call-out procedures in terms of my involvement, it was immediate. It was a 2-minute conversation, and those resources were already staging and getting ready to roll by the time I even said yes.
Are you comfortable with this paragraph now?
Well, no, I'm not now, because clearly in reading it, I can understand why some would think that that was misleading.
Okay.
But no intent to mislead.
In your July 12th interview, you talked at length about, for example, ERT response times, and you said words to the effect that you have to factor in if there was a call to the northern tip of Cape Breton and Meat Cove, and you could be looking at a response time of say, 6 hours. Here we're talking about, a community that's 30 minutes away from the second largest town in Nova Scotia, Truro, right?
Yes.
And are you critical of the ERT response time in this mass casualty event, arriving at 12:50?
I can't be critical of their time to gear up, mount up, and get to the scene, because they need to be able to get to that scene. They need to arrive safely to that scene. I don't think that there was any laissez-faire attitude applied. I do know this team, and I know how professional and dedicated they are. I believe that when they were mobilized, that they made every effort to get there as quickly as they could.
And similarly with EMRT at 12:55, the TAB at 1 a.m., the critical incident commander, 1 a.m. roughly, I think it was 1:19, and by the time the West reached the command post. So we're talking, 3+ hours in some cases before these assets are arriving to respond to a critical incident at a community that's, again, 30 minutes outside of the second largest town in Nova Scotia.
Advised by the command triangle that there was sufficient evidence that would support a charge, but to me, the central issue was the public interest aspect. And included in that public interest aspect would have been, one, the objectives that were set in the investigation, and two, how the families may have perceived whether we charged or did not charge.
So the optics were discussed, is that what you're saying?
Yes, I would say that the optics were discussed, yes.
And did the optics include that it might be perceived as an attempt to divert attention from the responsibility of the RCMP for what had happened on the night of the murders?
No, that actually never crossed my mind personally. Right. Although in the media, it became an issue.
So it crossed their mind, yes.
Yes, it crossed their mind. Yes. It didn't cross my mind. What was central to me in terms of the optics portion was, for example, in terms of domestic violence victims, victim blaming. I thought that would be a significant issue that would need to be addressed. In terms of the victim families and what their expectations were or weren't, how sympathetic they might be or non-sympathetic to Lisa Banfield. That was an area of concern for me. Those were the optic issues that I was thinking about. And also, another consideration that I personally had was, we were trying to advance the investigation in terms of the provision and the importation of the firearms. Firearms are only as dangerous as they can be unless you have the ammunition to place into those firearms. So that was another consideration that I was, personally, I was weighing out optically how that would look. It's one thing to have a gun. It's one thing to have bullets. It's another thing to have guns and bullets together, because then they can become lethal. You can certainly hurt someone with a gun without bullets, but you can't inflict the same level of carnage if you don't have ammunition for them.
You've gone on a bit, sir, but I just want to go back to the question I asked you that led to what you've been saying for the last several minutes. Did you venture an opinion as to whether or not charges should be laid against Lisa Banfield?
In that meeting?
Yes.
Yes, from Chief Superintendent Leather.
And did you support their decision, sir, to lay charges?
I supported their decision, meaning the decision that was made between the investigative team, the Command Triangle, and as I understand it, the Crown Prosecution Service, as well as the decision, and certainly Chief Superintendent Leather will be appearing before the Commission. I would expect that he may be asked similar questions, and I can recall him supporting that decision as well.
Okay. Do you, in your capacity, have access to a mobile radio 24/7 or a take-home police vehicle with a radio?
No, I don't. And in fact, as a matter of resourcing and funding, I had actually had a police vehicle assigned to me when I arrived here in Nova Scotia, and there was the creation of the human trafficking team, and there were not enough vehicles to go around, so I actually gave that unit my assigned police vehicle so that they could actually conduct operations. So I didn't even have an assigned police vehicle, and I believe that to this day there still is an assigned police vehicle to the support services officer.
Chief Superintendent Campbell, thank you again for assisting us with our work.
Thank you, and I know that there are very few family members that are in attendance, but I would imagine that many are watching or monitoring their proceedings. I want to express my sincere condolences, and I apologize for failing. I haven't cried for 2.5 years. And I'm truly sorry that we failed you. I promise that we'll do better.